Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening from Malaysia. My name is Aizat Shamsuddin and I will be your moderator today. First of all, on behalf of the organizers, I would like to welcome all of you to our second series of public forum entitled Charlie Hebdo, Ripple Effect in Nusantara. Bagi pihak penganjur, saya ingin mengalu-alukan kehadiran penonton malam ini ke forum bersiri yang kedua yang bertajuk Charlie Hebdo, Respon dan Kesannya di Nusantara. Thank you all for spending your precious time wherever you are with us. For your information, this International Public Forum series on Islam, freedom of expression and countering extremism is jointly organized by Sisters in Islam and Komuniti Muslim Universal. Besides, today's forum is our second series, as we had our first series last Wednesday with two brilliant panelists, Mustafa Akil and Marina Mahade, on terror attacks in France, conversations and responses in the Muslim world. So you may rewatch the discussion on our Facebook and YouTube pages that we will show you in a minute. I want to also inform you that we are now airing live on Sisters in Islam and Komuniti Muslim Universal's Facebook pages. You can see and share the details available on your screen just now. All right, so today we are very lucky to have with us a lineup of panelists who are not only knowledgeable in their own fields, but also experienced in the grassroots and policy works in Nusantara region, who I believe need no detailed introduction. However, I will do it anyway. First, we have Mohamed Imran Mohamed Taib, from Center for Interfaith Understanding Singapore. Imran is a founding board member and former director of Center for Interfaith Understanding Singapore. He's also director of Budi, an intercultural and Asian heritage consultancy based in Singapore. His work focuses on multiculturalism, interfaith relations, and Malay-Muslim reform. He was formerly with the Islamist Religious Council of Singapore, an associate research fellow at the Studies in International Relations in Plural Societies program S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS. His commentaries have appeared in Channel News Asia, Today, Straits Time, Berita Harian, Berita Media Corp, Jakarta Post, and other media channels. He is co-editor of Budi Kritik in 2009, a compilation of critical essays on Malay Muslim issues. He's also a graduate in philosophy. Next, we have with us Imam, Dr. Imam Nahe'i, from National Commission on Violence Against Women, also known as Komnas Perempuan Indonesia. Dr. Imam Nahe'i is a commissioner of the National Commission of Violence Against Women in Indonesia. He is also an academic at the University of Ibrahimi Sitobindo, Jawa Timur, Indonesia. His writing publications include Fiqh Anti-Human Trafficking, Fikih Keseharian Buruh Migran, Fikih Pluralis, dan Qawaid Fikih. He's also an alumnus of the education of Indonesian Ulama Council. He's also very active in educational discussions, workshops, training sessions in relations to human rights and gender. Besides that, he is part of a number of non-governmental organizations addressing issues of human rights and gender equality. And last but not least, we have with us Dwi Rubiyanti Kholifah from Asian Muslim Action Network Indonesia. Dwi Rubiyanti Kholifah is a Secretary General of Asian Muslim Action Network, or known as AMAN. Her engagement in women, peace and security started with the Indonesian program in 2007. With AMAN Indonesia, she initiated women's schools for peace to facilitate as a leadership incubator for women to strengthen community resilience through the role of women. She manages 39 women's schools for peace in 7 provinces of Indonesia and has been involved in more than 1,500 interfaith mothers as leaders of change. In implementing UNSCR 1325 on women, peace, and security, Aman has been actively facilitating constructive engagement of CSO in the decision-making process. Finally, she's also involved in the transformation within the Muslim community in Thailand by providing exchange between Indonesian Women Ulama Congress, or known as KUPI, and ulama from southern Thailand. So that's a little bit about our panelists today. So before we start with our discussion today, I would like to read a little bit of background just to give our audience and panelists today a context what we are trying to discuss. When President Emmanuel Macron defended Charlie Hebdo's satirical caricature of Prophet Mohammed in the name of secularism and freedom of expression, it is foreseeable that this would affect the emotional attachment of, if not all, 1.8 billion people identified as Muslims on this planet. Perhaps a large Muslims from diverse contexts who regard him as the most significant prophet in Islam and a role model to many Muslims. Then, when President Macron made a sweeping statement saying Islam is in crisis, followed by a nationwide crackdown on radical Islam, it further inflames the civilizational tension between the West and also the Muslim world. This is not the first that we have witnessed a ripple effect originated from the socio-political development of the Muslim communities in the West and in the Middle East that has given impacts to Nusantara region. I would like to cite few historical examples. For example, when Ayatollah Khomeini came to power in 1979 after Iranian Revolution, some Malaysians and Indonesians were inspired thinking that Islamic theocratic state is not an utopian idea in a modern time. Following that, we saw rapid institutionalization of religion in Malaysia and also increased political movement in Indonesia, such as Darul Islam. For many decades now, Iran has become one of the living examples of oppressive and hostile states against human rights, especially against political dissent and women. Moving to more recent development, when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, a self-proclaimed Islamic Kholifah, declared the establishment of Kholifah in Iraq and Syria, it has driven many radicalized Muslims around the world, including especially young men and young women from Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia to join this violent, barbaric, and most patriarchal organization. It has even reached here in our region, Southeast Asia, when ISIS recruits from Malaysia and Indonesia set up an Asian wilayah in Marawi in the Philippines. ISIS might have collapsed, but the ideological belief remains intact in some of our societies, sadly. In our case today, Charlie Hebdo's caricature of Prophet Muhammad and President Macron's controversial statement in France have resulted in different manifestations of disagreement in the Muslim world, such as debates, diplomatic protests, demonstrations. For example, in Bangladesh, tens of thousands of people joined a rally in Dhaka that was mobilized by one of the country's largest Islamist parties to condemn President Macron and demand a boycott of French goods. To the extent of monstrous violence against civilians in France in the name of protecting the sanctity of Islam. Yet we have not seen proportionate energy to denounce violence, but most importantly, we need to think in a broader sense that restricting freedom of expression and freedom of religion to legitimize others such as non-Muslim minorities, Muslim intra-faith minorities, women, political dissents to protect Islam is not a new phenomenon at all, either in our region, often being politicized. We can see in the case of Pak Ahok in Jakarta, in the case of Pak Ahok, Jakarta's Christian governor, who has been sentenced to 2 years in prison after being found guilty of blasphemy for citing a Quranic verse that permits Muslims to vote for non-Muslim leader. Also in Malaysia, there are a number of colonial laws and Sharia laws that we ourselves created to delegitimize and criminalize freedom of expression and belief of Shia, Ahmadiyya, feminist groups like Sisters in Islam and other people, because this is blasphemy and wrong to their perspective. So in our response, it's our response to hold the accountability of French government to uphold freedom of expression, religion, and belief of Muslim minorities in France is a hypocritical one and exclusive to us. Hence, the issues that we are going to discuss tonight are intersectional and very complex. We hope that we could cover the main topics or the main issues close to our region, Nusantara. For our participants, there will be time for questions and answers. Please show or put your comments in the Q&A box. Without further ado, I would like to have Imran as our first panelist to have the floor.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Greetings of peace to everyone. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Aizat has raised a lot of issues that actually has been the subject of the debate surrounding the drawings of Prophet Mohamed, peace be upon him, as well as the whole debate over free speech versus self-censorship. There's so many things that has been that has opened up a can of worms that right now we are debating, and I'm glad that at least within the Muslim communities, we have started to look at these issues and really interrogate and come into conversations, not just amongst ourselves, but across other communities that are also equally concerned about the developments that are happening around the world and which impact us, all of us here in Nusantara, in Muslim Southeast Asia too. So what I will do is begin by raising this term, Society of the Spectacle, by French thinker Guy Debord, who wrote in 1967, with the rise of mass media and globalization, actually, things that are happening across the world have suddenly thrust everyone into a limelight and generate the need for rather generated reactions. And these reactions then produce multiple forms of responses, which are actually contextual to the different individuals as well as groups and nations. So what I'm interested is actually looking at some of these key responses to what had happened recently with the murder of Samuel Paty, and also surrounding the issue of Charlie Hebdo. And you know, as I troll the internet over responses within the Muslim community over the issue, then it's interesting to observe some of the comments online amongst the Muslim communities, at least in the Malay-speaking world. And here I would say within Malaysia and Singapore in particular, in the Malay medium, responding to the situation seems to be of two types. Generally, yeah. One is the response of denialism, tending to deny that the perpetrators, like for example, the murderer of Samuel Paty was actually a Muslim. So there is some engagement with conspiracy theory, which is not something that is uncommon whenever we hear of terrorist attacks that are being perpetrated by Muslims. So the circulation of conspiracy theories that these are actually done by non-Muslim actors in order to defame Islam and put Muslim communities in a bad light is quite a prevalent idea within the responses of Malay-speaking audience in some of the news agencies' comments. Secondly is the kind of apologetic responses that I observed. For example, saying that, oh, well, they are done by Muslims, but these are not true Muslims, you know, they are not really representative of Islam, which is not wrong in itself. But the tendency to ignore the underlying issue of Muslim extremism itself is something that has not been addressed through this kind of apologetic responses. That is why you find that the reactions are a bit disproportionate towards the murder itself as compared to the outrage, which is not just in the streets of Bangladesh, Pakistan, or even Jakarta, that tend to be, the outrage tends to be towards the depiction of Prophet Muhammad rather than the act of violence by the perpetrators who felt that they have a sense of, they felt that they need to take actions into their own hands through violent means. And that can be contrasted with the response of the non-Muslim community in the English speaking segments, where the concern seems to be inverted towards what is the problem with these Muslims? Why are they creating all these kind of violent acts? And then subsequently calls for, of course, the often heard call for moderate Muslims to speak up, which has been ongoing since September 11. And here I would like to highlight that a lot of Muslim institutions have actually responded by issuing statements condemning the murder of Samuel Paty, as well as other acts of violence done by Muslims. But this doesn't cut ice with quite a significant segment of the Malay Muslim community, possibly because they've seen this as a bit too apologetic towards the West. And therefore, these institutions are slowly also, and this is a matter of concern, slowly losing credibility within the eyes of the Muslim public because they are seen to be too apologetic in their response and not strong enough in standing up to what they perceive to be a siege on Islam, a siege against the global Muslim community by Western powers who are out to depict Muslims in that manner. And so those issues actually complicate the responses, and it has spilled over into several key debates. And one is on the issue of free speech and censorship, including self-censorship. Yeah, we can discuss this a bit more in the discussion later. Second is the issue of blasphemy within Islam, and how does that infringe upon this whole idea of religious freedom and freedom of belief. And third is the whole debate over extremism itself and the need for reform within Muslim societies, which also can be complicated because of Macron's own statement that actually inflamed the Muslim community by saying that Islam is in a state of crisis. So there's so many things that are going on, and the responses are varied, and people tend to project their own experience in different locations towards the whole issue. So I thought that the very first thing that we need to do is actually to get a broader view and a contextual view, including a more nuanced view of actually the situation that is happening in Europe. And I will start by saying that first, I think we need to understand a bit more of the context of radicalization in France. And this is through various literatures that have been discussing the development of Islam in France. And I think it's best that we approach from that angle. Otherwise, everyone claims to be an expert in what is happening in France, even though they probably have never stepped a foot in France, or even if they've been to France, it's probably just to see the Eiffel Tower and to fly the streets, the shopping districts in Paris. But I think there's a bit more complexity in the situation in France. And let's look at the whole context of the rise of Muslim youths radicalization in France. Now, I'm not an expert in France, but this is based on the research that's been done by various scholars who are looking at those issues there. So what we are seeing right now is the rise of what is called the third generation of Muslims who are born and educated in France, and they are assertive as of their rights as citizens. But at the same time, a lot of them felt that they are disenfranchised, coming from migrant parentage. Yeah. Now, this is where this third generation was preceded by the first generation that actually was focusing more on carving spaces as they migrated into France, and they're largely coming from places like North America, North Africa, in various parts of the Arab world. So the first generation of migrants, the parents of this third generation of Muslims were focusing more in carving out spaces, and that's why they occupy a lot of the suburban areas, what is known as the banlieues, right? And subsequently, you find that throughout the process in the 1980s, they were marginalized by the second generation. Some of them are already naturalized as French citizens, but some were still not yet citizens. But the second generation were largely informed by Islamist politics. And they are informed by the ideas that were shaping the global movements, particularly the ideas coming from the Muslim Brotherhood. And this second generation were actually targeting the very young who were born and educated French Muslims. And they were questioning the earlier assimilationist policies of the Republic, putting greater demands, for example, on exclusive halal places and things like that. But the most important marker of the whole politics is over the issue of hijab. And 1989 was quite pivotal moment because that was when it erupted into the national scene over the issue of Muslim girls were not allowed to wear hijab in school, and it created a series of uproars, and including legal challenges since 1989, which then eventually led to the Stasi Commission that reaffirms the French version of secularism, laïcité, and by 2004, the law was eventually kind of settled the whole debate about whether schools can allow hijab or not through a very forceful enforcement of so-called ostentatious religious symbols in school, but understood that it was primarily targeting the hijab wearers, and therefore it's also known as the hijab ban in 2004. And by that time, the umbrella organization for Muslim groups in France began to decline because they are seen as no longer able to pursue Muslim interests of this new generation of French youths. Now, this is where we see in 2005, for some of you, probably you remember this whole Paris is burning, that phrase that was where the suburban areas were, the banlieues were actually erupting in a series of protests. It's impoverished parts of Paris. But what was interesting was during the protest was actually people were calming down, but then there was so-called provocation by the police force, and that includes gassing a mosque, and you find people who actually running out of the mosque during one of the prayer session, and that was a spark for subsequent further weeks of protests. And bear in mind that Sarkozy was the far-right leader, was actually the interior minister at the time. And this incident actually provided the grand narrative for the intergenerational shift in politics, which Gilles Kepel in his book Terror in France wrote that by revolting, by these youths revolting, they position themselves as now the true defenders of the honor of their families, whose dignity they claim had been deeply wounded by the profanation of place of worship during a time of collective prayer. And therefore now they stepped up as the defenders of Islam when their parents' generation have seen to have failed engaging with the French government in terms of pursuing Muslim interests. So that was quite a pivotal moment in this whole period. And of course, couple that with background of anti-Muslim and migrant racist attitudes, including xenophobia and the historical humiliation suffered by many Muslim countries as a result of French imperialism, and the global war on terror that seems to be focusing on the Muslims and the securitization of Muslims, all this created a kind of what Mark Sachman, who wrote a recent book called Misunderstanding Terrorism, has a kind of a block theory where terrorists mostly emerge from this loose and fluid and amorphous political protest community. So the whole issue needs to be understood from that lens of the resentment that people have towards the political process that is happening in Europe. And of course, with the rise of Islamophobia and the marginalization of Muslims, the lack of integration policies, all that created this block where terrorist organizations and extremists are able to leverage and tap on this fluid and amorphous political protest that emerge out of that situation. Now, the whole situation also create a prevalence of what is known as the double syndrome. And you can observe this also within the Malay Muslim community, where the sense of victimhood is very strong. And of course, there is a lot of historical baggage, and we don't want to go into deep details on that, but there is this sense that Islam is under siege by Western powers, right? I mean, it's been a narrative that has been going on since the age of colonialism. And couple that with a kind of glory-seeking savior complex where now I have to do something about it. I am going to defend Islam. And that is primarily the narrative that is being issued by terrorist organizations in order to attract these disgruntled youths towards doing something which they say that the parents' generation are not able to do that. And now they want to take things into their own hand, and the identification of the suffering as distant observers is very real. You will notice that a lot of the perpetrators of violence and the terrorists themselves, they don't come from Palestinians, for example, but they would identify themselves as fighting in the cause of the Palestinians or some other suffering Muslims in other parts of the world, but they themselves do not come from those suffering communities themselves. So it's the narrative that actually was shaping the rise of Muslim extremism, and we need to look into that and couple that with the political process. So I don't believe in this idea that, it's about right Islam versus wrong Islam. You just tell them what Islam says, the good things about Islam, then people will just somehow be drawn towards that. It's much more complicated than that. And you cannot respond these kind of issues theologically. I think that is a very important point that we need to belabor. And of course, this whole situation that was happening in France corresponds with the rise of the third wave of jihadist movements, and that can be seen through Abu Musab al-Suri, who coincidentally in 2005 wrote the Global Islamic Resistance Call, where he called for a more network-based system penetrating the enemy societies, in this case, Western societies, to be overthrown from the bottom up rather than the top down. And he was very critical himself. He was from Al-Qaeda. He was very critical of Osama himself, whom to him was a kind of, had a hubris. He wanted to do things at a spectacle, bringing down the Twin Towers from the top. But that has created, has unleashed a whole American forces, which eventually dismantled Al-Qaeda's infrastructure in Afghanistan. And he was very critical of that and said, now we have to try a different method. And ever since then, you find this third wave jihadists in Europe creating a lot, or rather perpetrating a lot of terrorist attacks in various parts of Europe, in Belgium, in Amsterdam, including in France itself. Yeah, the Bataclan was one of the most spectacle attacks that they have managed to execute. Now, and this is where the network of terrorist organizations extend to the two brothers who actually were part of, were involved in the Charlie Hebdo shooting in 2015. And therefore we need to understand this wider context before we even try to make sense of the situation in our part of the world. And here I will also look at some prominent cases that actually has its a string that tie all these things, including the recent 2020 beheading of Samuel Paty. 1989, as what Aizat has mentioned, was quite a pivotal moment. It was a watershed moment in British politics, especially because the Salman Rushdie affair actually put British society into turmoil by questioning the form of multiculturalism that has been practiced in British society since the 1970s. And where are the boundaries of tolerance and the limits of free speech that was unleashed over this whole controversy of Salman Rushdie affair? And we must remember that that period was also the end of the Cold War and the rise of Huntington's thesis later on the clash of civilizations, that now the world is locked into something that is much more deeper in terms of cultural contestations between the Islamic world and the West, for example. And communist death fatwa and the book burning was actually used by the far right also as to demonstrate the incompatibility of Western liberal values with the migrant societies that were taking root in Europe. And therefore, both were feeding off each other in terms of the whole discourse on multiculturalism. And this is where you find a shifting identity from race issues to religion. So that is why some scholars were to say that the issue of Islamophobia is just racism that is manifested in a new language in Europe. Very interestingly, Kenan Malik was observing this whole situation, and this is what he wrote. Now, you can read it on your own, because how much time do we have, Aizat?
You still have like 2-3 minutes. Is it fine?
Okay, let me just go quickly. And then we have the Danish cartoon controversy. Remember Gillian Poston? And again, it emerged out of the reaction against perceived threats to European liberal values of free speech and a culture of self-censorship that was seen to be taking root in Europe with the influx of the Muslim migrants. It started with Bridgen's complaint, actually, about not being able to find an illustrator for a children's book, which is the Quran and the Life of Prophet, pretty innocent. And then Fleming Rose was the culture editor of the Danish newspaper, wrote to the Illustrators Union in order to ask people to draw their interpretation of the figure of Mohamed. This is a way of reacting against self-censorship that is seen to be taking root in Danish societies. And 12 drawings were eventually submitted, but it's inconclusive thesis. That means it's not clear whether there was really self-censorship or it's just that they can't draw because they belong to a different newspaper and therefore they are not allowed to participate in this whole experiment. But eventually, the newspaper continued to publish it as an editorial and included all the drawings. Now, some of the drawings depicted Mohammed in not in a flattering manner, again, using the trope that, that he's promoting violence, etc. The idea of the terrorist Muslim, but some were pretty innocent. So everything was published. And even Rose mentioned in the interview that, and this is a very interesting quote, the cartoonists treated Islam the same way they treated Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and other religions. And by treating Muslims in Denmark as equals, they made a point. We are integrating you into the Danish tradition of satire because you are part of our society and not strangers. The cartoons are including rather than excluding Muslims. So it also shows a bit, well, it might be well-intentioned or not, we don't really know, but at least, it shows the kind of lack of understanding of the sentiments within the Muslim community at least. Now, Clausen wrote this very interesting study, The Cartoon That Shook the World, where the issue was seen as politics rather than theology, because the Danish imams actually, after failing to raise a court case against Gillian Poston, actually went around the world petitioning Muslim governments to actually boycott Denmark and to register their protests with the embassies. And that actually inflamed the Muslim world, and you find some of the protests turning violent across the world. Now, that was the situation then in 2005. Compare that with the controversy in 1980s over 3 years in the US Supreme Court room. Now, you go to the US Supreme Court room, you have this depiction of the Prophet. You can actually see it here. And it causes a lot of controversy. Some Muslim organizations, particularly those that were coming from the influence of Muslim Brotherhood, were protesting this, saying that this is blasphemous. And eventually, the whole matter was settled when a very prominent cleric, Sheikh Taha Jabir Al-Wani, issued a fatwa, and in fact was appreciative of it, because the way Prophet Muhammad was portrayed was actually to praise him as one of the contributors to the legacy of law in human societies. So it's actually praising Muhammad rather than putting him in a bad light, and therefore that is something that is welcome. But that was in the late 1980s, which is totally a different context now that we are facing. Now, if you look throughout Muslim history also, you'll find that depictions of the Prophet in positive ways have been happening for centuries. And these are some of the examples. And one of the books that you should actually be looking at if you are interested in this, not in a blasphemous sense, but rather in appreciative of the rich historical artistic depictions of the Prophet in drawings where his face is not covered, is this book actually. So clearly something political has shifted in terms of the Muslim sentiments towards this issue. Now, of course, then there's 2015 Charlie Hebdo shooting. And here we need to understand the context of satire in French culture. 2006, it's been they've republished the Danish cartoons and unsuccessfully sued in court. 2011, they featured a cartoon of Muhammad and they call it Charlie Hebdo. And then eventually, what happened in 2015, the attacks. After the attacks on the embassies and violent protests by extremists over other issues, they published nude caricatures of Muhammad. And that actually inflamed the situation. And Charlie Hebdo, which was a fringe satirical magazine ignored by the majority of French people, suddenly became prominent, and because they became the target of the terrorist groups that were emerging. And the 2015 attacks actually propelled them, and they will also raise the status of the magazine in the imagination of both Muslims, as well as utilized by far-right groups to demonstrate their depiction of Islam within a certain stereotypical tropes. Now, then that is where we need to understand what happened to Samuel Paty, and the context actually matters. Samuel Paty had actually used Charlie Hebdo's cartoon as a discussion point, and he has been showing the depictions for over many years. So it was not the first time, and it was used as a discussion point in his teaching about French culture and about the whole secularism, discussing secularism, free speech, etc. in his classes. And before he showed that photo, he asked those who were uncomfortable to leave the classroom, but a Muslim student did not get the memo. And then eventually she was in the class, she saw it, she told her parents. The parents were very upset, recorded a video denouncing the act of Samuel Paty of showing that Charlie Hebdo's cartoon, and eventually that inflamed the Muslim community, and someone took matters into his own hands, and you find him beheaded eventually. So that was the context, Now, as a final point of reflection, that once we know this whole bigger picture and the context, then it elicits a different kind of responses, and these are my personal reflections. The reactions are actually shaped by perceptions towards the incidents, and it is important for us to be more nuanced in terms of understanding the French context, rather than reading our context and putting it into the French situation in order to politicize our own positions on various issues that probably has nothing to do with the situation in France, but has got to do with our own internal politics here. So be mindful of that. Secondly is the internal contestation that is happening right now in Muslim societies. And we can't deny that there are different imaginations of Islam within different Muslim groups. And it's about time that we discuss this openly and honestly, rather than trying to see this as an issue of the Muslim world versus the West. Because what constitutes the Muslim world and what constitutes the West, it's a lot more nuanced, and there's a lot of contestations of ideas, even within Muslim communities, over a variety of issues, from democracy to gender equality to human rights issues, freedom of speech, and a whole host of other issues. This polarized position that you are either for free speech, absolutely, no one actually believes in absolute free speech, not even the French, yeah, versus self-censorship, that in order for us to not fall into that situation, then we need to self-censor. And that itself can be a problem, because it obscures actually the real issue that is being represented by extremist groups on both sides of the coin, whether it's Muslim extremists or the far-right groups that are actually utilizing this for their own political purposes, including authoritarian regimes that are interested in curtailing more freedoms by using this whole dichotomy between free speech and censorship. And this is where I find that the book by Sharon George called Hate Spin is a very good demonstration of how this culture of offense can be weaponized and expand extremist clutch over Muslim societies if we are not careful. But of course, this book doesn't just deal with Muslim societies and Muslim extremists. It also deals with, for example, the extremists amongst the Hindu nationalist groups, or even in the American context of the evangelical movements, etc. This hate spin is about manufactured vilification or indignation used as a political strategy that exploits group identities, like Islam as an identity marker, to mobilize supporters and coerce opponents. And his case study of the situation in Indonesia is very interesting, especially if you were to look at what happened over the case of Ahok, which I'm sure both Imam Nahe'i or Ruby will be sharing later on. Fifth is a check on hypocrisy over our stance on the issues. Now, this is where this book, Silence, which has a foreword actually by the late Abdurrahman Wahid Gusdur, is very instructive of the kind of how many Muslim regimes and countries are using blasphemy laws as a way to clamp down on any form of dissent, including what is perceived to be threats to the dominant groups that are controlling power, including religious institutions and groups. And therefore, as much as we talk about the West not having certain hypocrisies of their own, just look at Muslim countries and how they oppress the minorities within their own countries. What happened to the Ahmadiyas, what happened to the Shias, what happened even to atheists in these Muslim countries, where they are not able to profess their freedom of belief. That is something that actually puts a black dot on these Muslim regimes who are at the same time trying to speak up on behalf of the global Muslim Ummah against what they perceive to be Western incursions on Muslim issues. So keep a check on our own hypocrisy and stance over these issues, even as we want to talk about the hypocrisies of the West. But at the same time also, I think we really need to just not talk not just about free speech, because free speech in itself cannot sustain without the need for good speech, in which we don't engage in insults, we don't engage in demeaning of others, other religions, for example, even as much as we say that we must not allow blasphemy to be the marker in which we curtail the freedom of speech of another person. But at the same time, can we promote good speech in which we discuss some of our differences in a way that promotes greater understanding rather than creating, the kind of enmity and polarization that we are seeing happening in the name of free speech itself. And last but not least, this is where interreligious solidarity matters in terms of bringing these issues to the front. And if you were to think about it, if you go along the line of curtailing free speech in the name of someone being offended, then bear in mind that there will always be someone somewhere who will be offended over every single issue. And we cannot use that as a basis in terms of clamping down on speech. But if we recognize that it's bad speech, then it has to be countered equally through free speech with good speech. But of course, where we draw the line is when it enters into territories that is known as hate speech or even incitement to violence, then that is where there are laws in place in which we should be using in order to stop the spiraling down of violence and targeting of individuals rather than ideas. So I think I'll stop there and hopefully I've given enough order for discussions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imran. I believe that you have more to say. Unlucky that we have limited time for this, but sure we will continue that in the discussion. At this point, I shall talk in Malay. Sangat menarik poin dari Imran yang menyatakan pertama iaitu tentang proses radikalisasi terutamanya dalam kalangan anak muda ataupun generasi ketiga di Perancis. Disebabkan ketidakpuasan hati terhadap sistem politik, layanan yang tidak sama rata ataupun diskriminasi di Perancis itu sendiri yang menyebabkan berlakunya tindakan keganasan dan sebagainya. Kemudian Imran juga bercakap mengenai konflik antara kebebasan berekspresi dalam konteks barat dengan kepercayaan ataupun agama bagi komuniti Muslim di Barat itu sendiri. Dan apa yang paling menarik adalah apa yang berlaku di Barat perlu dibaca mengikut konteks di sana. Kerana jika kita tidak boleh hanya mengguna pakai konteks di sana sesuka hati kerana naratif tersebut bisa ataupun boleh digunakan oleh sesetengah pihak demi kepentingan politik masing-masing tanpa menyemak hipokrasi ataupun keganasan ataupun diskriminasi yang berlaku di bumi sendiri. Jadi untuk meneruskan perbincangan, saya ingin menjemput Dr. Imam Nahe'i untuk menjelaskan kepada kita tentang dari mana asalnya datang hukum anti penodaan agama ini dalam sejarah Islam dan bagaimana kita sebagai Muslim yang baik, yang cintakan keamanan perlu bertindak ataupun mungkin ada respon yang lebih baik. Silakan.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bismillah walhamdulillah wala haula wala quwata illa billah. Sahabat-sahabat sekalian yang sangat saya hormati, secara khusus Abang Imran Mohamed Taib, Bang Ruby dan juga Mas Aizat. Saya berpikir tidak mudah menelusuri bagaimana sejarah penodaan agama di dalam Islam. Karena melihat sejarah penodaan agama di dalam Islam itu meniscayakan, mengharuskan kita untuk menelisik, untuk menelusuri bagaimana teks-teks otoritatif di dalam Islam, mulai dari Al-Quran, hadis, kemudian turunan dari Al-Quran dan hadis yang sangat-sangat panjang, apalagi nanti dikaitkan dengan konteks kekinian. Jadi saya melihat bahwa menelusuri sejarah penodaan agama di dalam Islam itu pekerjaan yang bagi saya sangat sulit ya. Tetapi saya akan bercakap di dalam dua hal. Pertama, bagaimana sih sesungguhnya akar-akar penodaan agama di dalam Islam, dan yang kedua, bagaimana kemudian mewujud penodaan agama itu dalam undang-undang di Indonesia khususnya. Pertama, kalau kita merujuk di dalam teks-teks Al-Quran, kita akan menemukan beberapa ayat-ayat yang berbicara tentang larangan untuk menodai agama lain, umat lain, maupun agamanya sendiri. Di dalam Al-Quran misalnya ada bahasa as-sabbu. Sabbu itu mencaci maki, kursing ya, kursing, mencaci maki, kursing of religion, mencaci maki agama tertentu. Sabbu. Wala tasubbul ladzina yad'una min dunillahi fayusubbullaha udwan bighairi ilm. Jadi kita dalam ayat ini dilarang oleh Allah untuk mencaci, untuk memaki orang-orang yang menyembah selain Tuhan. Ini tentu saja orang-orang yang ateis. Kita tidak boleh mencaci mereka karena dia akan mencaci Allah. Ini kata-kata sabbu. Yang kedua, ada juga istihza. Istihza itu di dalam bahasa Indonesia maknanya mengolok-olok, sama dengan sukhriyah, la yaskhar qaumun min qaumin. Jadi kata sukhriyah atau istihza itu maknanya mengolok-olok. Di dalam Al-Qur'an juga disebut beberapa kali bahwa kita dilarang untuk melakukan istihza sebagaimana orang-orang munafik yang melakukan istihza. Itu bahasa yang kedua. Jadi sukhriyah dan istihza, mengolok-olok, ridiculing. Ya. Kemudian yang ketiga ada al-huzuwu wal-la'bu. Jadi mempermainkan agama, mempermainkan syiar-syiar agama. Bahasa lainnya al-ihanah. Jadi mempermainkan itu artinya mengihanah, merendahkan atau meremehkan sebuah agama. Jadi ihana wa tahkir, merendahkan dan menghinakan simbol-simbol agama. Itu yang ada di dalam Al-Quran. Kemudian ada juga misalnya di dalam beberapa surat Al-Quran, di dalam ayat Al-Quran ada riddah. Riddah itu irtidat atau murtad. Orang yang kembali dari agamanya, keluar dari agamanya menuju agama yang lain. Nah, itu riddah. Yang menarik adalah bahwa asabbu, mencaci maki, mengolok-olok, merendahkan, kemudian mempermainkan agama, menghinakan agama, itu tidak ada hukumannya di dalam Al-Quran. Jadi bahasa-bahasa asabbu, al-istihza, al-ihana yang kemudian ini nanti menjadi bahasa penodaan agama di dalam undang-undang di Indonesia, itu di dalam Al-Quran itu sesungguhnya tidak ada hukumannya pada awalnya, gitu. Nah, namun kemudian berkembang di dalam sumber-sumber yang lain seperti hadis Nabi, misalnya konsep tentang murtad. Jadi konsep tentang murtad, tentang riddah yang di dalam Al-Quran tidak ada hukumannya secara duniawi, ya, hukumannya nanti di akhirat sana. Itu kemudian ketika menjelma di dalam hadis Nabi, itu lalu ada hukumannya. Nah, kita sangat mengenal sebuah hadis yang berbunyi man baddala dinahu faqtuluh. Barang siapa yang mengganti agama maka bunuhlah. Walaupun ada hadis lain sesungguhnya yang memberikan catatan pada hadis ini. Jadi tidak semua orang yang keluar dari agama itu dibunuh. Di dalam hadis lain disebutkan at-tariku lidinihi al-mufariku lil jamaah. Jadi orang yang meninggalkan agama dan kemudian dia berpisah dari dari komunitasnya. Nah, itu baru bisa dibunuh. Jadi qatlur riddah fil Islam itu laisa ala itlaqihi. Jadi pembunuhan terhadap orang yang murtad itu tidak mutlak di dalam Islam. Ada catatan-catatannya. Nah, ini di dalam hadis. Pertanyaannya yang menarik adalah mengapa di dalam Al-Quran itu tidak ada hukumannya, sementara di dalam hadis ada hukumannya. Nah, ini berarti ada faktor mahalli ya, ada faktor lokalitas, bahkan saya menduga ada faktor politik yang menyebabkan riddah itu pelakunya dihukum. Saya kira sangat jelas ya, kenapa Imam Abu Hanifah misalnya menyatakan bahwa perempuan yang murtad itu tidak boleh dibunuh. Yang bisa dibunuh hanya laki-laki. Nah, ini menandakan bahwa ada alasan lain mengapa orang murtad itu dibunuh. Pasti bukan karena riddahnya, bukan karena dia murtad. Karena perempuan yang murtad tidak dibunuh. Itu berarti ada faktor lain. Nah, faktor lain inilah yang saya sebut sebagai faktor politik ketika itu. Karena dalam situasi perang, ketika orang keluar dari agama, dan itu bisa membahayakan komunitas di mana agama yang ditinggal itu. Nah, itulah faktor-faktor politik sesungguhnya. Kemudian ketika hadis ditafsirkan di dalam bentuk fikih hukum Islam, ini baru ramai nih, baru apa namanya, ijtihadnya sangat-sangat beragam. Nah, saya menduga penodaan agama itu disarikan dari pandangan-pandangan fikih ini, bukan dari pandangan Al-Quran maupun pandangan hadis. Nah, tentu saja kalau kita bicara fikih itu tidak bisa dilepaskan dari situasi sosial, dari situasi politik, dan dari situasi budaya di mana fikih itu dikarang. Maka di dalam konsep fikih itu riddah ini diperpanjang, diperlebar demikian luas. Misalnya ini kitab-kitab umum yang dijadikan rujukan ulama-ulama di Indonesia ya, termasuk juga ulama-ulama di berbagai tempat. Ketika membahas riddah itu adalah bisa terjadi dengan perbuatan dan dengan ucapan. Misalnya gitu, dengan perbuatan dengan ucapan. Nah, perbuatan ini orang bisa dianggap murtad ketika dia melakukan sesuatu kalau itu ada kesengajaan dan ada unsur merendahkan, ada unsur mengolok-olok. Itu baru orang dianggap bisa keluar dari agama. Misalnya yang dicontohkan itu seperti sujud pada berhala, kemudian melempar Al-Quran ke dalam kotoran. Kalau melempar Quran ke atas meja, saya kira itu masih debatable ya. Melempar meja ke atas lemari gitu. Tapi kalau melempar Quran fil qadurat, di dalam tong sampah misalnya, nah ini secara fi'il itu bisa dianggap murtad. Kemudian lalu murtad diperlebar lagi, bukan hanya perbuatan, tapi juga ucapan. Ucapan-ucapan yang menyebabkan orang keluar dari Islam. Nah, itu banyak sekali, tapi harus disertai dengan keyakinan dan kesengajaan. Nah, konsep-konsep inilah yang ada di dalam sejarah Islam ya. Dan yang menarik menurut saya, yang menarik itu sesungguhnya baik istihza, sukhriyah, kemudian asabbu dan seterusnya, itu sesungguhnya lebih mengatur pada internal umat Islam. Jadi umat Islam tidak boleh ini, tidak boleh melakukan ini. Tapi sama sekali tidak mengatur bagaimana kalau orang di luar Islam melakukan itu. Itu tidak ada itu, tidak diatur itu. Makanya saya membaca misalnya orang-orang yang mengaku Nabi di masa Nabi, ada Musailamah Al-Kadzab misalnya. Pada zaman Nabi itu tidak diapa-apakan sama Nabi. Dia justru baru dibunuh pada zaman Kholifah Sayyidina Utsman. Gitu. Ini berarti ada faktor politik yang menyebabkan Musailamah Al-Kadzab yang mengaku Nabi itu dibunuh. Pada zaman Nabi dia tidak diapa-apakan. Bahkan pada masa Sayyidina Abu Bakar dan masa Umar itu tidak diapa-apakan. Nah, jadi konsep-konsep riddah itu sesungguhnya awalnya itu mengatur internal umat Islam bagaimana orang yang sudah muslim itu tidak keluar dari agama. tapi tidak mengatur bagaimana kalau orang di luar Islam melakukan hal-hal itu semuanya, gitu. Nah, itu yang saya lihat di dalam sejarah Islam ya. Nah, kemudian sepertinya konsep-konsep tentang riddah itu lalu ditarik ya oleh masyarakat Muslim di Indonesia untuk menghukum juga orang di luar Islam, gitu. Jadi saya kira ini sudah peralihan konsep sesungguhnya, peralihan konsep. Jadi dari konsep yang awalnya riddah itu mengatur umat Islam bagaimana tidak keluar dari Islam, kemudian dia digunakan juga pada orang di luar Islam bahwa kalau dia melakukan begini, maka dia dianggap sebagai menodai agama. Dan itu sebenarnya tidak ada masalah. Kenapa? Karena sesungguhnya bisa terjadi orang di luar Islam memang melakukan sabbu, istisya dan seterusnya. Tetapi itu tidak ada hukumannya di dalam Islam. Jadi dia lebih sebagai pijakan moral bermasyarakat bahwa kalian tidak boleh ini, tidak boleh ini. Dan itu tidak ada hukumannya. Kecuali riddah ya. Kalau riddah memang ada hukumannya di dalam Islam, itu pun sebenarnya ada faktor-faktor politik. Nah, bagaimana kemudian penodaan agama yang saya duga itu disarikan dari konsep-konsep riddah yang sesungguhnya itu mengatur internal umat Islam, kemudian menjadi penodaan agama yang lalu mengatur seluruh umat manusia, seluruh orang, setiap orang. Nah, kalau di Indonesia saya menduga itu kalau lihat sejarahnya ya di Indonesia ini, nanti Pak Ruby bisa menambahin. Itu kan awalnya setelah kemerdekaan itu terjadi pergeseran, konflik yang sangat panas antara Muslim tradisionalis, katakanlah dulu ini Muslim tradisionalis itu ya orang-orang NU, orang-orang Muhammadiyah, dan juga Muslim-Muslim lain yang tradisionalis, itu berkonflik sangat panas dengan aliran-aliran kepercayaan, agama-agama leluhur. Karena di Indonesia sebelum agama-agama ekspor itu hadir, itu kan agama leluhur sangat banyak, bahkan sampai sekarang. Nah, setelah kemerdekaan, ini terjadi konflik yang sangat panas antara agama baru ini, agama-agama yang hadir ke Indonesia ini dengan agama-agama lokal. Dan agama-agama baru ini, Muslim-Muslim tradisionalis ini kemudian mendorong Presiden Soekarno ketika itu untuk mengatur bagaimana penodaan agama. Karena banyak agama-agama leluhur ketika itu dianggap oleh Muslim tradisionalis ini melakukan penodaan agama dengan praktek-praktek ibadahnya. Nah, nampaknya faktor politik itu lebih mendorong pada dukungan pada kelompok-kelompok Muslim tradisionalis itu. Maka muncullah undang-undang penodaan agama ini. Jadi sesungguhnya kehadiran undang-undang penodaan agama di Indonesia itu karena faktor politis. Itu yang pertama ya. Yang berikutnya adalah yang menarik, konsep-konsep penodaan agama di Indonesia itu tidak jelas. Hampir semua kawan-kawan pembela hak asasi manusia di Indonesia mengatakan bahwa undang-undang penodaan agama yang ada di KUHP pasal 156A itu, nah itu para penggerak hak asasi manusia di Indonesia mengatakan bahwa undang-undang itu multitafsir dan sangat rentan untuk digunakan oleh kekuasaan. Dan faktanya begitu memang, faktanya begitu. Nah, kebetulan saya seringkali melakukan pembelaan di pengadilan pada orang-orang yang diduga melakukan penodaan agama. Contoh yang paling sederhana kemarin perempuan non-Muslim yang membawa anjing ke sebuah masjid. Nah, itu kan kemudian dianggap penodaan agama, gitu. Padahal sesungguhnya membawa anjing itu kan sebenarnya dia simbol. Apakah dia menodai agama atau tidak? Ini kan sebenarnya debatable itu. debatable-nya misalnya anjing itu suci apa najis gitu. Nah, kalau bagi Imam Malik misalnya membawa anjing ke masjid itu bukan sebagai penodaan agama karena anjing sesuatu yang suci, sesuatu yang baik-baik saja gitu. Beberapa frasa-frasa di dalam undang-undang penodaan agama itu. Dan kalau berdasarkan analisis kawan-kawan di Indonesia, pada umumnya orang-orang yang dituduh dituduh melakukan penodaan agama itu baru bisa dijerat oleh hukum ketika ada tekanan dari massa. Nah, pada umumnya kalau tidak ada tekanan dari massa pasti dia bebas karena memang undang-undangnya multitafsir. Nah, tapi ketika ada tekanan massa maka undang-undang itu menjadi tumpul, hakim menjadi kalah oleh tekanan mayoritas. Itulah fakta tentang penodaan agama di Indonesia. Kalau kita melihat konsep-konsep awal ke dalam Islam, itu sesungguhnya memang banyak perdebatan tentang apa sih yang disebut dengan penodaan agama itu. Agama yang seperti apa yang yang ketika dia diganggu, dia dianggap menodai agama. Itu tidak ada standar yang baku di dalam Islam. Misalnya standar yang dibuat oleh ulama itu tentang al-usul wal furu', al-qat'iyat wad dhanniyat itu. Jadi kalau mengganggu atau memahami agama dalam konteks usul dan qat'iyah yang berbeda dengan berlawanan dengan pandangan mayoritas ya dalam wilayah usul dan qat'i ini, maka itu dianggap sebagai keluar dari agama. Itu dianggap sebagai penodaan. Tapi pertanyaannya adalah apa yang dianggap usul dan donniat itu juga ulama berbeda pendapat. Tidak ada yang satu suara berkaitan dengan apa itu konsep usul, apa itu konsep qat'iyat. Itu tidak satu suara, itu berbeda-beda. Apalagi tafsiran Majelis Ulama Indonesia ya di Indonesia bahwa penafsiran yang menyalahi pokok-pokok agama, Nah, pokok-pokok agama ini juga sangat debatable. Gitu. Kenapa ya? Karena tidak ada dalil yang tunggal untuk memahami apa itu pokok-pokok agama. Contohnya seperti misalnya tadi yang dikatakan oleh Mas Bang Imran soal menggambar Nabi. Menggambar Nabi itu masalah usul atau masalah furu'. Itu qat'i apa doni? Pasti kalau cari dalilnya enggak ada itu. Enggak ada. Saya dulu pernah menulis satu artikel, Nabi itu boleh digambar menggunakan tulisan, tapi tidak boleh digambar menggunakan menggunakan lisan, tapi tidak boleh digambar menggunakan lukisan gitu. Jadi kalau digambar menggunakan lisan boleh, pakai bahasa. Nabi itu wajahnya begini, alisnya begini, hidungnya begini, itu boleh digambarkan dengan menggunakan lisan, tapi tidak boleh digambar menggunakan lukisan. Nah, itu sesungguhnya kan debatable, tidak ada yang qat'i itu. Maka sebenarnya ada sebagian ulama yang mengatakan tidak semua tafsir yang menyalahi hal yang mujma' alaih yang disepakati ulama itu dianggap sesat, dianggap menodai agama. Ada mujma' alaih yang di mana orang sebenarnya bisa berbeda di situ. Misalnya mujma' alaih yang tidak ada dalilnya dan tidak diketahui oleh publik misalnya. Jadi seperti misalnya membuat kartun Nabi. Kartun Nabi itu sebenarnya bukan soal kartunnya. Karena kartun itu kan bisa sebagai simbol penghormatan, sebagai simbol pengagungan gitu. Jadi kartun itu sebenarnya sebagai buntut dari tidak bolehnya menggambar Nabi itu. Dan menggambar Nabi itu masih muhtalaf sesungguhnya karena memang tidak ada dalil yang qat'i. Jadi memang penodaan agama ini secara teologi itu bermasalah. Ini yang pertama. Nah, yang keberapa ini? Sudah yang ketiga ya. Yang keempat terakhir, memang di dalam fikih atau di dalam Islam itu dikenal dengan konsep takzir. Takzir itu artinya hal-hal yang dilarang oleh agama itu negara atas dasar kemaslahatan itu boleh memberikan hukuman. Gitu. Kalau di dalam Islam kan ada hudud, ada kisos. Kalau hudud ini kan sudah ada apa namanya? Ada pakemnya sendiri-sendiri, ada dobitnya sendiri-sendiri. Nah, yang tidak ada dobitnya, tidak ada pakemnya, itu disebut dengan takzir. Nah, takzir itu penodaan agama ini, itu kalau menurut konsep fikihnya, hukum Islamnya, itu sebenarnya masuk dalam kategori takzir. Karena masuk dalam kategori takzir, maka sesungguhnya dia tergantung pada cara pandang negara. Gitu. Jadi kalau negara menghapuskan konsep penodaan agama itu karena dipandang justru dihapuskan itu membawa masalah, maka itu sesungguhnya absah. Tapi negara masih tetap aja mempertahankan penodaan agama karena ada faktor-faktor yang saya kira sangat politis itu. Saya kira itu dari saya. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Dr. Nahe'i. Penjelasannya amat baik sekali, terutamanya mengenai sebenarnya tiada asas sebenarnya dalam sumber Islam itu sendiri, mau dari Al-Quran, tetapi banyak yang undang-undang blasphemy ataupun anti penodaan agama ini banyak dipengaruhi oleh faktor-faktor politik ataupun sosial semasa. Alright, at this point, I will try to summarize in English as I can. Dr. Imam Nahe'i explained to us that there's no origin of Islam, of blasphemy law in Islam, especially in the Quran. The practice of blasphemy law is heavily influenced by the political and social situations. He gave an example in Indonesia where the anti-blasphemy law is pretty much implemented in a double standard way, especially according to the majoritarian interpretation of the law itself. So we will go to our next panelist, but Ruby is having a difficulty to reconnect with the internet. Perhaps we can answer one of the questions here in the Q&A before we get Ruby to come back with us. All right. At the same time, I encourage all participants to ask questions in the Q&A box, whether in English and in Malay. So we will go to the first questions here. Perhaps this is for Imran or for Dr. Nahe'i. From Kelvin Ose. Melihat krisis Islamofobia, serangan keganasan di New Zealand didorong oleh teori The Great Replacement yang menuduh Islam sebagai world domination di negara-negara barat. Mohon respon. Soalan kedua, Presiden Macron mengeluarkan kenyataan kontroversi bahawa Islam memerlukan reformasi di seluruh dunia. Jika benar, apakah reformasi yang perlu dibawa dalam dunia Islam? Jadi kita dapatkan respon. Can we get a response from Imran or Dr. Nahe'i? Before we go to Ruby.
Yeah, I'll just quickly respond to the second question first. I think of all people, it should not have come from Macron. And this is where I think we need to understand the context of France itself and Macron's own context in order for us to respond. I know in our part of the world, there are people who are working towards reformism, seems to be agreeing with what Macron is saying. But we have to be clear that Macron is saying in a certain context in France, where he himself has shown to be quite Islamophobic in many of his policies and stance. towards the Muslim communities there. So if any expression of reform within the Muslim societies, it should not have come from him. But having said that, if we look at the substantive matter about the need for reform in Muslim societies, then we can agree on that in that sense. And especially reform in the political theory of governance in a modern plural societies that we are in right now. I think we need to have a debate on that. To what extent the separation of state and religion, to what extent the need for democratic institutions to be built up in Muslim societies and to keep in check on authoritarian regimes and the tendency to monopolize Islam coming from certain sectors with interest and power and influence. These are the kind of issues that needs to be debated. And this is where reform in Muslim thought is really necessary in order to bring our societies forward. That's my response to the second question.
Thank you, Imran. Dr. Nahe'i ada respon mengenai adakah Islam ini perlu disemak semula ataupun direform?
Kalau menurut saya ya, sesungguhnya nilai-nilai yang ada di dalam Al-Quran, kitab suci awal ini itu sangat luar biasa. Bagaimana mengajarkan tentang kehidupan keragaman dan toleransi. Tetapi kemudian dia diturunkan di dalam hadis dan di dalam kitab-kitab fikih itu atas dasar cara pandang para penafsir, para ulama yang dibalut atau yang sesuai dalam konteks politik, sosial dan budayanya. Nah, oleh karena itu pandangan-pandangan yang keras terhadap terhadap orang lain itu sesungguhnya bukan dalam kitab sucinya, tapi di dalam tafsir terhadap kitab suci itu. Nah, oleh karena itu penting umat Islam saat ini itu merujukkan pandangan-pandangan para ulama itu ke dalam nilai-nilai dasar yang ada di dalam Al-Quran itu, dikembalikan gitu. Jadi jangan berpijak pada tradisi fikih yang dia sesungguhnya lahir dalam konteks politik dan sosial tertentu, tapi bagaimana pandangan-pandangan ini itu diposisikan atau dikembalikan atau ditakar dengan prinsip-prinsip dan nilai-nilai agung yang ada di dalam Al-Quran. Saya kira ini perlu dilakukan ya, karena di dalam tradisi umat Islam kita itu masih sangat kuat berpijak terhadap pandangan-pandangan ulama dan tidak enggan untuk menarik kembali kepada nilai-nilai kitab suci. Saya kira itu penting untuk dilakukan ke depan.
Baik. Terima kasih kerana responnya. Ruby, can we proceed with you?
Yeah. Sorry, I have a internet problem, so I'm sorry if I suddenly off from the meeting is because of the bad signal here. But I try my best. So I'm going to share with you one of the interesting from Imran regarding with the violent extremism, but in a particular context on women issue. So my presentation will be, I'm doing reflection on the phenomena of Charlie Hebdo, and then how does it make different dealing with the women in CVE in Indonesia? Though maybe it's too difficult because we don't have particularly research, but I think there are some interesting, how do you call it, path that we can actually bring up into the discussion. My first reflection, okay, before that, I'm practitioners. So I've been working with the women, peace and security, and in the last 3 years, my work is more on advocating gender mainstreaming in policy relating with CVE in Indonesia. So, and then the others is trying to influence the national policy to use the lens of women, peace and security when it's responding to violent extremism. Is not separation in terms of the policy, but we're trying to influence the government to use more integrated policy. So my first reflection to the Charlie Hebdo phenomenon, for me, is like a wake-up call for all of us to revisit the limitation of the legal framework on freedom of expression and speech. We know that we have a global legal framework to obligate states to respect freedom of expression and opinion or religion, which is binding on every state party. But if you're looking at Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19, I think it will be very happy. In Indonesia also, we adopted it into our constitution. But if we read carefully, so the freedom of expression doesn't mean that absolute freedom, but it has it's qualified rights, which means that the rights of the individual must be balanced against the interests of society. So, you know, some restriction can be allowed under some factors, like for the sake of national security or public safety, prevention of disorder or crime, for example, protect health or morals. That is debatable, talking about morals, and then protection of the reputation of rights and others, and some of the factors that very much need to be considered when we understand about the concept of freedom of expression and also opinion. And then the restriction is lawful, meaning that it cannot be translated one by one. Each individual, if they translate it by themselves, is gonna be chaos. So the regulation is needed in this case. Therefore, the state is very much important to have a role in regulate the law relating with what are the restrictions will be. My second reflection relating with the Charlie Hebdo phenomenon is a wake-up call for reviewing our national regulation. I think Pak Kiai already mentioned a lot. We are happy that we actually adopted the Human Rights Declaration in our constitution, but in terms of the implementation, Indonesia is still struggling in law enforcement regarding the issue of freedom of opinion, expression, religion, and I myself engaging, for example, since 2011 in advocating the rights of minority Shia. Have been fled from the village, and until now they still cannot, come back or return to their village, and that is remain, unsolved until now. And other things for me at domestic level is the state response must be strong, promote interfaith unity, but able to mitigate violent backlash from particular groups. We know that sometimes the state's inconsistent. That is creating distrust among some of the group, and also that is creating, a lot of chance for intolerance group keeping trying. The other is tackling more effective the intolerance group and the role of social media. I think Indonesia dealing a lot with the social media, and it's become one of threat national threat, I think, because the social media are able to reshaping the public characters, including as fertilizer of the growing of ustads, intolerant ustads or intolerant religious preacher. Yeah, we call it ustad instant, because it's suddenly to be ustad and suddenly teaching Islam and suddenly having a lot of followers and suddenly become popular. And crazy thing that the people of Indonesia, some of them happy to be follower instead of they actually learning from real ustads that actually having strong Islamic knowledge. And I feel that freedom of expression, freedom of religion need to be actually aligned with the domestic policy relating with violent extremism. I am very much feeling like disconnected when I work with this countering violent extremism. But then you will see that the groups that are working on freedom of religion and expression, for example, doesn't really actually connect with the advocacy surrounding of violent extremism. So the work is still very disconnected. And the other is actually my concern on the peace journalism that actually should promote tolerance, value, gender equality, interfaith unity. But however, I think sensational journalism is much more popular, and also like feeding the public or the public feed by the journalists. We don't know about that, but this all happening. That's very easy. Hate speech been spreading all over Indonesia, and also very easy actually people be influenced by the hate speech. The last my reflection is actually this is the wake up call for reviewing our capacity of peace. So why don't we create a space for reflection while we responding the Charlie Hebdo phenomena? Isn't it the fact that some of the Muslims too much obsessed with the beard and hijab? Isn't it? Isn't it true that many terrorists actually declare as a Muslim and use Islamic texts to justify? It is also true that there are more violent extremist drivers by right-wing ideology and extremist nationalists. Yes, yeah, but the fact that many terrorists, in particular in the context of Indonesia, if you're asking all of the terrorists confess that they are Muslim, that's actually the fact that we have to accept and then we have to criticize. So can we respond with the more strategically and committed to not perform violence? So that is the big question. And then the other is understanding that Muslims are diverse. So when the public actually generalize that all Muslim protesting about the using violence is of course totally wrong, and that is part of the Muslim, yes. But I think it always nice to see that within the diversity among the Muslim that you will see that how many criticism and how many that strategic way that Muslim also respond not using violence. However, I'm very glad that our president did not actually come up with a provocative statement, rather actually trying to bring the more unity among the different groups in Indonesia. I also come across that Charlie Hebdo also published some of the cartoon relating with the women. It's very provocative. 2019, for example, if you Google, you will see the cover image of vagina with the football inside it. That actually responded the women football competition, yeah, at that time. And also there is a cartoon, the women with hijab, but the face is like a monkey. They say that the Muslim woman is a monkey. It is because of 19 years of old Mariam talk in the YouTube about student protest that actually come up with that cartoon. And some of the cartoon are very much actually humiliated, yes, but at the same time, as students, as the alumni of the Faculty of Letters, I always trying to see that the message behind that, and that's been our we need to have that kind of reflection in my understanding, that I think it is also wake up call for us to revisit our conservative interpretation, perhaps that's spreading in our social media and others. So it is important to revisit the role of women in public, about the hijab, about wanita soleha, polygamy, relation with the differences, kekerasan sexual violence, for example, and some of the controversial issue that Muslim and also many ulama currently under HUPI, Indonesia Women Ulama Congress, has been advocating, and particularly in advocating the bill on the eradication of the sexual violence. So whether the Charlie cartoon actually increase visibility of women in fundamentalism, look at some of the changes about trend of the terrorism now, not only in Indonesia, I think in the world. But I borrow from the Professor Ruhaini saying that the shifting trend of terrorism is from backyard to dining room. I hope using that metaphor can help you to understand that before, the group is very much a secret, clandestine group. They are often using the economic approach, but it is actually hidden agenda on that. And normally women and children, they don't know about what happened in with the husband. And the other is about the fact the actors mostly dominated by men. But I think it's been changed a lot in terms of, if you see that a lot of actors, new actors, women and also children, engaged in, including voluntarily or being forced or because of the marriage, they engage and how do you call it? Give themselves as the persecutor. And the other things, there are more and more family now. I mean, the radicalization in the family is more common currently. If you recall the bombing in Surabaya, for example, that is actually indicating that the radicalization happening in the whole family member. And according to some consultation happened in 2018, the Majlis Ta'lim, what is that? The religious gathering now, they have a new version that's the whole family engaged, not only separation between men and women. So other things that's shifting a lot is actually gender roles. You may see that we cannot use the binary opposition perspective and looking at gender, that we are progressive, they are not. No, in some cases, they are very much also progressive in terms of bringing the narrative of the feminist. For example, my body is mine, so I can do exercise whatever that I want. So that they also can, their leadership in public, they can take up a lot of new roles that never been actually done by women group in extremists. But now it's become very much familiar. Then if you're looking at the vulnerabilities of women driving to violent extremism in the context of Indonesia, this I actually summarized from the National Digital Consultation on Reviewing Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan recently. So there are 7 elements. One is history of radicalism in Indonesia. I think Kiai already mentioned that Indonesia has a strong root on radicalism that is actually still exists until now. The economic injustice, lack of media literacy, dysfunctional family. What we mean by dysfunctional family is here. This is one of the big factors. The situation where family does not have strong function anymore. I mean, can be broken family, can be the parents already radicalized, that of course easily the children will be radicalized. And then the other vulnerability is identity crisis, textual religious interpretation, and the last one is the increasing politicizing identity. I think Imran pointed out that what happened in Jakarta election and also the last election 2019, that also showing how identity politics is very popular and has been used as the strategy for a political party to win the election. And I think until now, people are still using, some people who have capital are keeping using that how do you call it, dangerous weapon. So then I believe in the record done by IPAC, the International Policy Analysis on Conflict, released the report 35 relating with the evolution of Indonesia women extremists, in particular pointing out about Jemaah Islamiyah, saying that the changing trend, what the report means by changing trend is in 1980s when the Jamaah Islamiyah was only concerned on two issues, hijab and marriage. So the women have to have hijab, and secondly, the women have marriage and give birth as much as possible. And 1993, it has shifted. Not only two important issues, but the other important issue is the women playing important role in economic empowerment. Why? Because a lot of follower of Jamaah Islamiyah, and specifically male, they have to go training. And because of that, that actually the women taking care of the family. Not only that, the marriage has become more and more important strategy for this group, not only for growing the children, but also expanding the group into the new area. For example, if they want to expand the work in Central Sulawesi, then they send somebody and married with a local girl. And so the marriage is by arranged. And then 2018 until 2016, in particular with the presence of social media, the role is more and more strategic. So they engage more now in the chatting rooms, in particular relating with the ideology. They are also a good writer of a lot of content, as well as they are creating more online dating and fundraising. In the context of Indonesia, they are using a lot social media to raise funds. And that is the dangerous thing, because the public sometimes don't know about the hidden agenda just because of it is religion. So people just, donate. And then whether this actually will possibly increase violence against women, absolutely yes. If you see the women are diverse in the context of violent extremism movement, I divide the four categories. Number one is the women in the circle of the radical group. They are much more use their body as the instrument. So they've been actually manipulated by the group in the name of women empowerment. But the fact is that actually they're using the body. They never have the concept of women empowerment. Most of the time that actually this because of the trick, because of they want to win the girl. The second cluster that's actually very much also vulnerable on gender-based violence is the deportees and returnees. Those women, maybe they are not intentionally supporting ISIS in terms of fighting, but they believe in Islamic State and they want to get welfare or maybe some others benefit because of the propaganda. And then when they actually arrive in Indonesia back, and then what happened? Then they receive stigmatization, discrimination, bullying, social exclusion, lack of long-term rehabilitation, lack of support for reintegration, as well as lack of access to safe school, because the children also being bullied and also discriminated. And quickly, I want to pick up the cluster relating with the women survivor of bombing. That also invisibility, they are invisible, the story just there, but very rare we pick up the story. And then there are a lot of disabilities they experience now with the disability, lack of access to recovery. But currently, I'm very happy to share with you that Indonesia government recently approved the regulation number 35 year 2020 relating with providing reparation and also long-term support for the survivor of bombing. And lastly, friends, the victimization and lack of representation, those women living in the area where actually extremist group dominant, also facing a lot of discrimination, lack of safety feeling, targeted by night curfew, discrimination by law, as well as online GBV. So online gender-based violence has become wider, spread, and I think that's another picture of violence that we need to really care and we need to make sure that the regulation is also able to tackle it strongly. So lastly, then my slide will be, what about the response of the religious institution? I am glad that Indonesia is very diverse. And I am very glad that Indonesia never been Islamic State, luckily. So then you will see like very diverse religious institution, putting their statement. Muhammadiyah, for example, concerned on saying that Presiden Macron adalah tipikal pemimpin yang bisa membawa pada pertentangan dan permusuhan tanpa ada sebuah hujatan atau sebuah ajakan untuk marah atau untuk resist, ya, penting ini. Kemudian Nahdlatul Ulama, statementnya juga sangat menyejukkan. Penghinaan terhadap Nabi Muhammad dengan cara membunuh pelaku adalah tindakan biadab yang berpotensi memicu ketidakstabilan antar umat. Kemudian Majelis Ulama Indonesia ini yang agak berbeda. Bunyinya seperti ini. Kalau ada umat Islam yang melakukan tindak kekerasan, maka jangan hanya mereka yang disalahkan. Tapi yang harus lebih disalahkan lagi adalah orang yang telah memantik reaksi dari umat Islam tersebut. Ya, jadi teman-teman bisa mencerna ya, beda statement. Tapi akhirnya Presiden Jokowi menutup semua debate itu dengan sebuah statement bahwa kebebasan berekspresi yang mencederai kehormatan, kesucian serta kesakralan nilai-nilai dan simbol agama sama sekali tidak bisa dibenarkan dan harus dihentikan. Kemudian beliau juga menyeru tentang unity agar semua agama tetap bersatu dan tetap untuk merespon dengan kepala dingin, sehingga setelah itu perdebatan di media sosial trennya berubah begitu ya. Nah, kami Aman Indonesia tetap melakukan upaya-upaya dialog, intra-interfaith dialog. Kami lebih banyak sekarang menggunakan KUPI untuk men-challenge male ulama agar mereka mau menerima gagasan gender equality dengan narasi baru dari Mubadalah, Then we have tried in southern Thailand, dialogue with the Salafi group in southern Thailand about gender equality. And I think the narrative of Mubadala is easier to be accepted before we enter more in the idea of gender equality. And also working at the grassroots level, we're still continuing. Until now, we are still preparing to respond the terror act, respond for the victim of terrorism in Central Sulawesi recently, together with the network. So to end my presentation, I think we, as a Muslim, we have to be critical, yes, but we cannot tolerate any, how do you call it, action that actually provoke angry, provoke, clash, provoke violence and those things. But on the other hand, I think promoting multiculturalism, engaging more dialogue, and open more safe space for minority to engage. In particularly, we have a big homework with the intra-faith dialogue, sehingga Aman juga intensif untuk engage women ulama dari Sunni, Syiah, Salafi, Wahhabi, Ahmadi, to be able to share their personal journeys in understanding controversial issues, and then come up with a more nice collaboration for all of them. Whether they can accept our tafsir, maybe not right away, but at least they can understand that there are something different with what they have been read so far. So I have to end now. Thank you so much, Aizat.
Thank you very much, Ruby. Very comprehensive presentation. So to be able to have like a Q&A session, just quickly, Ruby has explained to us about freedom of expression should be qualified, not absolute, and also how the ripple effect in France could increase the radicalization in Nusantara if people rely on the stories of the sufferings of Muslims over there. But the most important thing from Ruby is that it's a reflection for our states, our societies to review our practices that could radicalize people, or radicalize especially young people. For example, the inequality, the socioeconomic inequality, and also the inclusion of the minorities itself should be improved in Nusantara. And also how this extremist ideology has a wide or large impact on gender equality itself. Extremist groups or fundamentalist groups growing day by day in our region, especially Indonesia, and try to bring extreme ideologies or ideas that subjugate women, into cannot be in a public space, and moral policing on their dress code, so on and so forth. So we have a lot of questions here. Maybe we'll start with Imran. Maybe you want to pick up one of the questions, Imran, that interest you the most.
I'm not sure. I did not troll through the whole thing. Maybe you can pick one for me.
Yes, sure.
I want to address there's one about asking about my comment on Macron. I just want to clarify here that, I think, if I'm not mistaken, just a few months, or is it earlier this year, his approval ratings have actually gone down, and the French public concerns, three major concerns was on the French government's handling of the COVID-19. Secondly, it's on the declining purchasing power of the French people in general with the decline of the economy. And thirdly is on their whole outlook towards the social security system that seems to be very bleak for the French. But instead of focusing on all this, in his bid for re-election, he has adopted something that some observers and commentators have described as the playbook of the far right, including, for example, using diversionary tactics to kind of put a collective punishment on Muslims for going against what is seen as the Republican values of French society, and therefore securitizing the entire Muslim community, which was already under siege with the rise of the populist sentiments against the Muslim migrant community. And of course, this kind of crude discourse has also led to, for example, the shutting down of some mosques and even NGOs that were tracking anti-Muslim sentiments in France. So all this is seen as an attempt by Macron to actually focus on Islam as the problem in France rather than other socioeconomic factors that are actually impeding his re-election bid.
All right. Could you also please address this question on what are your suggestions to address politicized Islam in Nusantara?
Different countries might have their different approaches, but I think as a rule of thumb, it would be wise to reconsider what Nurhalis Majid, for example, has mentioned about Islam yes, Party Islam no, in the 70s when he raised that slogan, has a way of looking at politics as the field of the profane, whereas religion is the field of the sacred. So when you mix these two, you begin to lose your whole perspective towards what is religion, which is entrenched in values and practices that informs the community of believers as compared to your bid for power. And that is precisely what is happening in many Muslim societies that actually uses Islam as a marker in order to gain political power. And they're willing to exploit every issues in the Muslim community. And we are seeing that all over the world of Muslim leaders trying to position themselves as the champion of the Muslim Ummah when they are actually also doing things that are oppressing against fellow Muslims in their own country and restricting a lot of their rights and their freedoms. So we must be clear that whenever a politician makes use of Islam in that sense, we have to be very careful to see what is the interest at work. And Islam should be left to the community of believers to negotiate and to make sense of their whole entire ideas on it, rather than allow it to the state to dictate what Islam is for all citizens, because then that will actually muddy the whole water and make Islam being politicized by states who are actually interested in gaining power more than anything else.
All right. Thank you, Imran. Maybe this one is for Dr. Imam Nahe'i. So this is very interesting because it's ini soalan mengenai Malaysia. Jadi baru-baru ini ada di Malaysia insiden seorang ahli politik yang mengeluarkan statement mengatakan bahawa Injil, kitab Injil itu telah diubah. Jadi itu adalah satu statement yang berasaskan hate speech atau mungkin menyinggung perasaan minoriti Kristian di Malaysia. Jadi apa respon Dr. Imam Nahe'i mengenai statement ini? Mungkin bagaimana kita dalam konteks Malaysia misalnya, di mana Muslim itu merupakan penduduk majoriti, bagaimana kita harus bermuamalah dengan masyarakat minoriti? Silakan.
Ya, saya kira kecenderungan yang terjadi di Malaysia itu sama yang terjadi juga di Indonesia. Jadi seakan-akan kalau mayoritas itu boleh ngomong apa saja tentang agama orang lain, tapi kalau minoritas tidak boleh ngomong sedikit apapun tentang agama lain. Jadi saya kira ini cara pandang yang harus segera dirubah ya. Oleh karena itu saya sebenarnya tidak setuju pada umat Islam yang memperdebatkan Injil, memperdebatkan kitab orang lain. Itu kan masih banyak di YouTube di Indonesia itu debat Muslim Kristen. Yang didebat adalah kitabnya masing-masing. Saya kira perdebatan tentang kitab agama orang lain itu sudah tidak boleh lagi dilakukan, itu harus dihentikan. Semuanya harus menghormati kitab orang lain. Kalau kita akan masuk mengkritik kitab orang lain, maka kitab umat Islam sendiri sebenarnya tidak bisa bersih dari kritik. Orang bisa mengkritik. Misalnya dalam apalagi qiraah sab'ah ya, qiraah sab'ah itu macam-macam bacaannya itu. Saya punya kitab namanya Kitabul Masahib, itu karangan Abu Dawud As-Sijistani, ulama abad keempat. Itu menggambarkan bagaimana teks Al-Quran itu ada banyak perbedaan pembacaan di kalangan para sahabat-sahabat. Nah, kalau orang Kristen mau mengkritik kitab Al-Quran, itu kitab pun juga ada banyak perbedaan. Umat Islam mengkritik kitabnya Injilnya umat Kristen. Tidak pernah selesai itu. Tidak pernah selesai. Dan itu hanya akan memperburuk pergaulan sosial aja. Jadi bagi saya, umat Islam tidak perlulah mengkritik-kritik kembali kepada hal-hal yang dianggap suci oleh agama tertentu, demikian pula sebaliknya. Ini yang pertama. Yang kedua, seharusnya nilai-nilai tidak boleh melakukan perendahan, kemudian caci maki terhadap ajaran agama manapun, itu lebih sebagai pola hubungan yang beradab antara sesama manusia dengan berbagai latar perbedaan dan keyakinannya, bukan sebagai cara untuk menghukum orang gitu. Selama ini kan penodaan agama itu sebagai cara untuk menghukum orang lain atas dasar politik tertentu. Nah, kalau kita akan kembali kepada kitab suci, misalnya umat Islam ya, saya kira penodaan agama itu sebagai cara aturan tentang larangan penodaan agama maksudnya. Itu sebagai cara bagaimana membangun hubungan antar umat manusia yang pasti memang berbeda latar belakang keyakinan dan agamanya. Jadi itu bukan sebagai cara menghukum. Jadi sekarang misalnya itu kan sekarang di Indonesia misalnya ya, penodaan agama itu kan sebagai cara untuk menghukum orang yang berbeda. Misalnya si A dianggap sesat kata Pak Rubi. Oleh karena itu dia mengalami kekerasan. Ahmadiyah dianggap sesat di Indonesia, bahkan mungkin juga di Malaysia sama saja itu. Ahmadiyah dianggap sesat. Oleh karena itu ibadah masjidnya ditutup, tidak boleh melakukan ibadah, tidak boleh menyebarkan ajarannya, dan kemudian lalu mengalami kekerasan. Nah, ini ajaran tentang bagaimana menghormati keyakinan itu dianggap sebagai cara untuk menghukum. Itu saya kira mesti dikembalikan kepada ajaran dasarnya ya, bahwa kalau menurut kitab suci Al-Quran, larangan-larangan untuk melakukan penodaan agama itu lebih pada bagaimana membangun toleransi, membangun persahabatan antar umat manusia yang memang pasti berbeda secara keyakinan. Dan itu adalah bagian dari sunnatullah itu. Saya kira itu ya tanggapan saya. Syukran.
Terima kasih Dr. Nahe'i. Kemudian kita ada soalan. We have a question from Nurhayati Khan. This question should be posed to Ruby, because you mentioned about dialogue just now, how we should have dialogue in order to cultivate peaceful values, so on and so forth. So the question is, how do we engage in intra-faith and intra-cultural dialogue if our efforts are consistently being dismissed as the exception, not to the rule? So she gave an example in Belgium where she resides as in a non-Muslim society, tend to dismiss her views as not representative, as they think the views of Moroccan or Turkish Muslims. So maybe you could guide us, what are the principles, or how do you manage the dialogue yourself, especially like coming from a women or female leader? Maybe there must be a certain or unique challenges.
Yeah. If we talk about dialogue, you can translate
Ruby, a bit unclear. Maybe perhaps closer to the mic. Yep.
Okay. Check. Yes. If we talk about dialogue, I have learned that we need to have a more creative and innovative means of how actually engage people. One that we actually did in 7 provinces through the Women's School for Peace, that actually more practical because the space to have dialogue is introduced by external like us, but people accept, and then people realizing that this is the need, because after the conflict, for example, the Muslim and Christian, they live together in the community, but they don't actually interact each other. So we thought that it should be a place where actually people can meet, and then people also can exchange. People even can further to build their own community in collaborative way. So the Women's School for Peace was initiated at the beginning for the learning media, that they learn a lot of new perspective as well as the skill of dialogue. But then, if you imagining dialogue that the women actually done in the community level at the beginning, they pick up the dialogue about food. That actually unimaginable for me actually. The food, the forbidden, the haram, halal that we consider, they're actually creating a lot of tension and revenge among them, because the Muslim no longer freely actually engage in the party that actually Christian neighbor invited, or even the Muslim could not actually receive the food coming from Christian. That actually started after the conflict in end of 1999. When we entered 2010, so situation is still like that. But then actually daily or intensive meeting and also accompaniment process on the women empowerment, that actually creating more and more space in the community. And other thing, actually, we intentionally bring them to visit each of the worship house in order to be familiar with, as well as to bring all the sensitive issue that they would like to ask to the religious scholar there, or the religious leaders and other members. So that actually the first time in the mothers in the community that they enter the other, the worship house from different religion. And then that actually breaking the silence from the community that it is fine. We supposed to do this for a long time. Our grandmother, our grandfather actually did like this. But then because of the conflict, we forget our memory of, peace. And then all of in our memory is dominated by violence, and they could not interact each other. The other dialogue that I share with you, among the women, we use the approach called reflective structure dialogue, a dialogue bringing a common understanding and set up with the structure of the question and the structure in the room, and very formal. But that the most, for me, the most enlightening a dialogue, because they can freely asking something sensitive within Shia, Ahmadi, and some other, school of thoughts, or even the political affiliation. In principle, don't force dialogue to find solution. You will actually ruin the process. Create a dialogue where people can speak and talk honestly, where people can feel comfortable to share, and that actually trust begin. Then actually you can add more, another series of dialogue, until you will find that seeds of solution coming from the conversation that you can execute after the dialogue. When you started dialogue to get solution right away, I think that is dangerous, because people not confident enough to talk, or people still feeling don't trust, and then they push to be able, to agree on something, and that actually not organic. And for me, I really avoiding this kind of process. Therefore, dialogue is really needing extra effort and taking longer. If you have a good preparation on the dialogue, you will have a good result. And that is my advice. Maybe we can share more relating with the structured reflective dialogue that we applying right now in 3 cities, Solo, Tasikmalaya, and Malang. That is the most very strong radicalism happening there. So next time we can share more, or we can invite into the training. Thank you, Aizat.
Thank you very much. While we add, solution, or how do we encourage more dialogue, I want to go to Imran very quickly, because we're going to finish around 10:15. So we're talking about the ripple effect from France to Nusantara. So in your context in Singapore, I also believe that you're doing some work in interfaith issue or intrafaith issue. So what do you feel about this, the effectiveness of dialogue, or your position on dialogue itself, and the importance of dialogue in the context of where Muslims are minority?
Yeah, of course, I will agree. Dialogue is very important, but I will also question what the real background. Yeah, I think what I will add is what matters is really what the dialogue should be about, and what should be the focus of the dialogue. And here, I think people fear things that they do not know. And therefore, they tend to rely, therefore, on secondary knowledge or secondary sources to inform their views of a particular community, for example. And that is where a lot of stereotypes they were informed of. Their lens is informed by stereotypes and also prejudices without understanding in intimate level with the groups that you're talking about. Take in the Malay world, for example, every single thing is often pointed towards the Jews. But when you ask a Malay person, how many Jewish person do you know? Most of them will say they don't know a single Jewish person. And yet they have this grand view that the Jews are everywhere trying to dominate over the world. So that is precisely the problem. When we don't know each other well, we tend to rely on a lot of these stereotypes, negative stereotypes, as well as prejudices that are abound. In some of my work, for example, with intrafaith issues, I've heard comments being made about the Shia community that is totally bizarre. Like, for example, someone was commenting that she had heard that Shia people have actually tails, ekor di belakang, di punggung. Tails, I mean, it's ridiculous, but it's a way of underscoring the point that you actually dehumanize someone that you don't really know. And that's precisely what happened to the Jews, that lead up to the Holocaust, where they were being depicted in a certain way in order to elicit a response because they are seen as a problematic group. And this is always about the minorities amongst us that is being the target of this kind of dehumanization process that comes from our own fear and our own way of trying to maintain the majoritarian position. So establishing dialogue is a way forward, where you actually allow someone to get to know a person from that community in a first-hand encounter. And talk about lived reality rather than talk about theology, because theology, there will always be differences. We don't start by engaging in theology. We start by engaging in each other's lived reality, which eventually will lead people to also talk about theological differences, and we should not sweep it under the carpet. We should discuss it honestly, but only after that level of trust and friendship has been developed that you are able to discuss more sensitive or even difficult conversations. And that will be more productive because you would know how to agree to disagree with each other. And I think that is the fruitful way forward in terms of dealing with our differences in society. So the moment you encounter a difference, your first reaction is not to say that they are trying to undermine me. You know, they are just simply being themselves, just like I want to be myself when I'm in a different context. So a Muslim who cries so much about being treated with discrimination in Europe, they have no thoughts about how they themselves are discriminating against other minorities, whether it's within their own religion or outside their own religion, in their own home country when they are majority. So these kind of contradictions need to be brought out for people to confront with this kind of hypocrisy and therefore find a better way forward. Looking at how Muslims who feel how much they are being discriminated when they are in a minority should also feel for other groups that are in a minority when they are in the majority. So this kind of intergroup solidarity needs to be developed, and that can be developed through dialogue process. Of course, I can go on and on, but I think I'll just stop here for the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's the main problem with the world, honestly. Like, we tend to exclude others and dehumanize others, and we don't understand each other, and that's why conflicts and war happened, between human beings. So I think we have had a very rich discussions with our panelists tonight or today. Thank you very much, Imran, Dr. Imam, Nahe'i, Ruby, for spending your time with us tonight. And please do not leave Zoom yet for our participants. I have a couple of announcements to make. Indeed, it's been a very enlightening discussion, and I think our three speakers have simplified for us the complexity and the breadth of issues, the intersection of many issues, freedom of expression, freedom of religion and belief. And indeed, they have provided us with much points or thoughts to ponder on. I'm sure we will continue this discussion within our homes, within our communities. Here with Sisters in Islam and Komuniti Muslim Universal, we will continue the conversation next week in the context closer to our home country, Malaysia. So do not forget to mark it on your calendar and join us next week. Perhaps we could have a slide on the screen. Yep. All right, so for further improvement, we would like to kindly request your cooperation, especially our audience, to complete a feedback form about our forum today that will appear on your screen shortly. So this will help us improve the coordination of our next event or program. Yep, there are only 2 questions to be completed. All right. I think that's it. So lastly, on behalf of Sisters in Islam and Komuniti Muslim Universal, I would like to extend my gratitude to our brilliant speakers tonight and our loyal audience for staying or for being with us until the end of the discussion. So that's all from me, Aizat, Shamsuddin. Stay safe and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.